Hello everyone, Books with Bags back again, and I finally finished reading all 5 entries in Sarah J. Maas's super popular ACOTAR, or A Court of Thorns and Roses series. I just finished book 5, A Court of Silver Flames, a couple days ago. So what I'm going to do today is start off with a spoiler-free ranking of all 5 books. All 5 right here. And then I'll move on to a spoiler review and reaction to this 5th and most recent novel, Silver Flames. But without any further ado, let's get right into it, the spoiler-free ranking. In 5th place, so unfortunately, something has to go in last place. I have found that even at its worst, I've enjoyed this series more than I expected, including this book. There's nuggets of intrigue and introspection in here, well worth any fan's time, but almost by default, the more novella-length entry, the 4th book, A Court of Frost and Starlight, lands itself solidly in last place and 5th place. I don't anticipate this being a particularly controversial or bold take. It's pretty short and ultimately amounts to a bunch of quick snapshots of our heroes, all trying to get winter solstice gifts for each other for the upcoming holiday. It's a holiday book. It's a nice change of pace, a calmer story, a time to relax, which is good after all the war and excitement of the couple books that came before, but there's just not a ton going on here. A big chunk of this one honestly feels like just setup or kind of an extended prologue to the 5th book. But I will say it's nice to get that third-person limited perspective on more of our heroes for the first time. Having thus far only been stuck in one first-person POV and the occasional, like a couple chapters here and there, third person for one character in those first 3 books. So that was nice, getting to kind of jump around a little bit more. But in the end, it just doesn't pack enough of a punch. I would never suggest skipping it, but definitely go in understanding that this is just going to be a quaint little holiday book with some teases of the potential tensions and conflicts to come. Yeah, Court of Frost and Starlight, 5th place. Then in 4th and 3rd place. 4th and 3rd places are actually the most difficult for me to decide, which I think is a little unusual. I feel like usually with rankings like this, they get harder and harder the higher up you go. So like 1st and 2nd place is usually the hardest spot. But this time, those are pretty much locked in place, 1st and 2nd. So yeah, which would go in 4th, which would go in 3rd. That was a little more difficult. I'll show you what both of them are, not specifically which is which. 4th and 3rd are the 1st book, A Court of Thorns and Roses, or the 5th one, A Court of Silver Flames. The one that started it all, and the most recent one. Basically, both of these are beginnings of stories. Thorns and Roses starts the adventures of one character and kicks off that original trilogy, and Silver Flames shifts focus to, presumably, start its own set of books. But we'll have to see where Maas takes this series going forward. So 2 different beginnings, 2 different leading ladies. Which one do I rank in 4th place? Regrettably, I'm giving this spot to Silver Flames, my most recent read, and I'll go more in depth on why in my spoiler-filled review in the second half of the video, don't worry. But basically, I feel like while some of the symbolism and repetition and themes did work very well here, and while I actually found this protagonist slightly more interesting than the series' main protagonist, all of that is buried beneath an awkward abundance of poorly timed sex scenes, one quirky physical trial repeated ad nauseum, and yet another fetch quest. And by this point, go find these 2 halves of whatever, these 3 legs of whatever, these 3 made artifacts, whatever. All of that, it's getting a little bit old. That said, there's some stuff I really like in this book. For example, 1 or 2 of the items our team is looking for. I find their unique magical properties open the door on so many exciting possibilities and directions for Maas to take the series in, so that's cool. There's some exciting stuff with a weaponsmith. There's some great stuff about trauma recovery and supporting victims. I really enjoyed the large chunk of this book set in a library. So yeah, there's stuff to like here, definitely, but there's too many kind of other annoyances that I can't look past. where I can't put this book any higher than 4th place. I will say, though, depending on what happens in the follow-up book, if it turns out a lot of what I thought was a bit long-winded fluff in this one turns out to be more relevant for book 6, well, I could see my opinion of Silver Flames bumped up maybe 1 spot, but for now, it's firmly in 4th place. If you're in the middle of the series, though, and discouraged by my having the 2 most recent books at the bottom of my ranking, please don't be. As I said, there's still a ton to enjoy here, and it's still well worth reading through. So then, in 3rd place, we have, of course, the other beginning book, the actual first one, A Court of Thorns and Roses. I had some idea of what to expect from this, the idea that it was romantasy, the idea that it might be a dark take on the Beauty and the Beast trope, but I did not expect to be so intrigued and hooked by the mystery around every scene. This stranger in a strange land, how does magic work? Who's this mysterious her they're talking about? What's under the mountain? All of it was really intriguing. And then the whole 3rd act feels almost like a completely different novel, but it fits. It's because it feels different because of how much our protagonist has been kept in the dark, how much she's been unaware of up to that point. I will say, though, 2 big things keep this first book out of the top 2 spots. 1, the protagonist doesn't have quite as much of an emotional character arc to go on as she'll come to have in books 2 and 3. She's more just at the mercy of the other characters in the lands and all the kind of mysterious plots that they've got going on. And the other reason that keeps us out of the top 2 spots, because of a very successful rug pull, action-packed, exciting, twisty kind of final act, all of that kind of comes at the cost of basically cleaving the first 300 pages or so of the series from the rest of the series, making it feel really kind of separate and different, where we really get to know and love a stronger and more compelling cast with more compelling goals and storylines in the books to come. Still, a fun, dark, mysterious, and exciting introduction into this world. I hope I haven't given too much away in how I talked about that. Then in 2nd place, I kind of lied. 2nd and 1st place they are still pretty close. But the truth is, I probably enjoy several hundred pages out of this book, the most out of the whole series. But it's just there's a few things with the end of this one that I find a bit frustrating. And I'm of course talking about book 3, A Court of Wings and Ruin. I felt like the fetch quest stuff was most controlled here and gave way to more interesting political scheming, striking deals with former rivals to gain allies in a war, or one character going undercover in a really tricky and messy kind of situation, or a big council meeting of most of the nobility. This is all my favorite sections, my favorite stuff of the entire series, not to mention this being book 3. By this point, we're really getting to know the main cast of heroes and bringing in and developing even more side characters. For example, the character who kind of takes over as lead in book 5, I start to really like her in this one. But I do think there's a bit of a fairy tale, almost too happy of an ending for everything that's happened by the end of this one. And there's one big sort of hero moment that I feel gets ripped out of an interesting character's hands and gifted to a boring and somewhat annoying tertiary, nearly forgotten character in the 11th hour. So yeah, there's a few things with the ending of this book that don't quite work for me. I have a more dedicated review of this one if you'd like to hear my more specific thoughts on the ending. But yeah, I'd say at least 600 pages of this book. It's my favorite stretch of the whole series, maybe with one exception. Of course, that would be 1st place. The ending of my 1st place book might be that exception. It's so gripping and tense and dark and upsetting, but all in the right ways, sort of, without spoiling too much. An Empire Strikes Back kind of an ending, and a complete 180 the complete 180 that we've gone on over the course of this book, following our main character's growth to get to that gut-wrenching kind of cliffhanging conclusion, setting up all of what I love about the 3rd book. Yeah, you already know my favorite book in the series is Book 2, A Court of Mist and Fury. This one is also a beginning of sorts. It's kind of like the main character's introduction to the world, now that all of the mystery and haze of Book 1 has been peeled away. And here's where we get to see the really fascinating court system and magic system, even more detail. And even more intriguing and powerful characters kind of step onto the stage for the first time. Sure, there's a fetch quest here, but it's the first time Maas really does that in the series, so it's not become tired yet. And there's a bit of political intrigue as well, court leaders visiting and dealing with each other, discussing the threat the potential threat across the sea, potential for a war, all the tension building towards a possible war. Even though I said that most of Book 3 is my favorite stretch of the series, everything in Book 2 is really, really good too, just about as good as the stuff in the third one. And then, of course, I've already alluded to how much I like this ending. I also really like the trauma recovery journey Maas takes our protagonist on. I think she tells this part of the story in a convincing and mature way. I think she tries and, for the most part, succeeds in telling another trauma recovery story in Book 5, but even with almost double the page time and even with a slightly more interesting lead character, that recovery journey isn't quite as compelling in Book 5 as the character's journey is in Book 2, I think. Also, the romance was rare in this one, but simmering and building throughout the whole book, so much so that I started to compare and contrast in my mind what techniques romance authors use to build tension towards a romantic climax, in the same way they might build tension towards an action-packed battle sequence. Maas does both very well, especially in a book like A Court of Mist and Fury. For all of those reasons, Book 2 gets the top spot, but it's really close with Wings and Ruin, and then third place is close between Thorns and Roses and Silver Flames, and Frost and Starlight is unsurprisingly a solid last place. So there you have it, my spoiler-free ranking of Maas's ACOTAR series. Please comment down below your ranking and or your thoughts on mine, or if you're in the middle of the series, your thoughts so far. But now I'll shift to spoilers. Here's your spoiler warning, as I want to do a more detailed review of Book 5, A Court of Silver Flames. You've been warned, here we go. So this book was published in 2021, and even though I haven't read her other series, I should say that I'm vaguely aware that her series are starting to overlap slightly, much in the same way other fantasy authors like Brandon Sanderson have loosely connected series all within one big shared universe. I can't speak to whether or not any of those connections popped up in this one, or in this book, not having read the other two series, Throne of Glass and Crescent City, though Maas does introduce the harp in this book, a device that can bend time and space and transport users through those dimensions, so I can easily see how this book is contributing to the idea that these series are starting to connect a little bit more and more. I'm not sure how much of that was on her mind when Maas was deciding how to structure the novel, but she did make several unique and interesting choices here, kind of using the Christmas novella Frost and Starlight as a bridge into this new POV, Nesta Archeron. Also, now we're third-person limited, bouncing between Nesta and Cassian, a switch I really enjoyed, seeing as Feyre and Rhys have basically already had their trilogy to develop into the goody two-shoes we needed them to be to win the war, both pretty virtuous and kind individuals anyway, so pivoting to a more cynical, romantic pair and a pair of POVs, I thought this was a smart move. Really smart choice. And it also let Maas explore the aftermath of the war from some fresh and unique perspectives, allowing readers a little bit of time to re-examine everything that went down in that war and call into question whether or not it really was kind of they lived a happily ever after sort of ending. Now sure, Nesta can be a bit of a pill, and I can understand readers getting frustrated with how much she lashes out at her family and those trying to help her. The hurt people idea can only be taken so far, I get that, but I do think one of this book's strengths is displaying how unique everyone's trauma, response, and recovery journeys can be, and how there's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to PTSD and similar mental health crises. So I actually really like Nesta's emotional journey, recovering her inner strength, her inner peace, in a bit of an on-the-nose way, I might not have been as excited reading her journey, though, as I was reading about Feyre coming to terms with Tamlin's more subtle abuses in the earlier books. I still think the work Maas did there in books 2 and 3 made for a better story, but that's not to say that Nesta's journey is bad by any means. For example, some of the things I enjoyed with her recovery, her slowly but surely developing grit and determination to train and to build a trusted community of friends of her own. Emery and Gwyn were brilliant touches and brilliant characters by which Maas could explore even more varied types of trauma recovery. The whole idea of the library as well. While introduced a couple books ago, I really enjoyed how Maas fleshed out that setting and how she put Nesta there to help her recover. And easily one of my favorite sequences of the whole book was just after Nesta's revealed to Feyre that she might die in childbirth. Cassian flies Nesta to the mountains for them to hike for a week. This breaking Nesta down to rock bottom and her final emotional release at the lake shore, that sequence made most of the sometimes tedious character growth absolutely worth it. Two of my favorite lines from the book come from that part. One about the scenery and another something Cassian says. First, on page 496, describing the mountains, quote, "It was all so still, yet watchful somehow, as if she were surrounded by something ancient and half awake, as if each peak had its own moods and preferences, like whether the clouds clung to or avoided them, or trees lined their sides or left them bare. Their shapes were so odd and long that they looked as if behemoths had once lain down beside rivers, pulled a rumpled blanket over themselves, and fallen asleep forever." Just a really beautiful way to describe the mountains, and it gave me such a clear image of what Nesta was seeing, and and where her mind was at that time. And then later on page 506, Cassian says, and this is after she breaks down, he says, "I'll be with you every step of the way, just don't lock me out. You want to walk in silence for a week, I'm fine with that, so long as you talk to me at the end of it." And I think that's just a perfect encapsulation of how good Maas is at writing Cassian as this ultimate supportive friend and lover. So I am really glad I read this book for moments like that. And not to mention the action-packed moments when our heroes go to find both the mask and the harp, even though it's yet another treasure hunt kind of structure, and I'm a bit tired of those in the series. I did enjoy both of those parts, specifically going under the prison to get the harp. But this is a 750-page book, and there's a decent chunk of this that just isn't that much fun to read. Continuing on talking about Nesta's character growth, we have to address the stairs issue. So if you haven't read the book and just don't mind spoilers, here's what this kind of scenario is like. Nesta's family and friends, they think she's ruining her life, drinking and sleeping around and being petty and mean. So they have Cassian take her up to a mountain home, really a mountain palace high above the city. She's free to leave whenever she wants, but to leave and return to her life of debauchery, she has to descend a flight of 10,000 winding steps. So Maas begins this really obvious kind of metaphor for inner strength and determination of Nesta attempting to descend the stairs every now and then. She keeps making it a little bit further before giving up and turning around to go back up the steps. But there's such an awkward flaw in the logic of the metaphor because it's so much harder to climb back up the steps than it is to walk down them. So at first, sure, when she's only making it a couple hundred steps down, maybe it makes sense for her to turn around and go back up. But when she gets to the point of getting like 6,000 steps down and then decides to go back up that same 6,000 instead of just walking down the remaining 4,000, it just doesn't really make much sense. I was trying to give Maas the benefit of the doubt at first. I was trying to puzzle out things like, okay, so is she trying to say that deep down Nesta really wants to get better, otherwise she wouldn't keep going back up? Or is maybe Maas, is she trying to say how easy it is to fall back into bad habits and an unhealthy lifestyle? The ease represented by how much easier it is to go down the steps, but how much more difficult it is to climb out of that unhealthy lifestyle hole. Maybe some of that is part of it, but honestly, by the end of the book, it really kind of just seems like the steps is a way to give Nesta the leg muscles and fortitude to be able to climb a mountain with her friend on her back. Needless to say, I can't shake the feeling that it's one of the kind of most poorly thought out symbolic metaphors I've come across. It just doesn't really work for me. And it's written the same every time, with the down and down and down, around and around and around, step by step by step. All of that represents how painfully repetitive this task would actually be, sure, but reading it for like the 10th time is just kind of like, who cares? Here we go again, dum-de-dum-de-dum, dum-de-dum-de-dum, whatever. Yeah, so that's the kind of the steps issue, and that's just a weird annoyance that pops up every now and then. Now let's talk about two other problems I found with this book. One major, one minor. First, the big one, the sex. I don't mind a raunchy sex scene here and there. I think Maas writes them pretty well, steamy enough, and I actually like how the first few sex scenes in this book give us a very different flavor and type of romance than what we had with Feyre and Rhys. It's as refreshing as the POV shift, and I think it's a strength in the early first couple hundred pages, especially that slow burn tension, even this sort of joking favor for a favor, building to more and more sexual activity between Cassian and Nesta. It's not bad at first, but I think the tipping point for me, when it became a bit of a distraction from the narrative at hand, when I'd go so far as to call it gratuitous, maybe just thrown in because there wasn't enough other exciting stuff going on. The tipping point comes around halfway through the book. Cassian has just told Nesta that her sister, Feyre's pregnancy, will potentially be fatal to both Feyre and the child. And literally, like a couple paragraphs later, they're joking about oral sex. Or reminiscing, kind of. And it's just totally out of nowhere and out of character for either of them to be thinking and talking about that right after talking about such a devastating and depressing thing with Feyre's pregnancy. And from then on out, I really kind of started to look at all of these scenes with a bit of a more skeptical eye. Like, are we actually learning anything new about either of them in these moments anymore? Is any of this adding texture or progress to the world or story, respectively? And usually my answer was no, unfortunately. And then my other minor issue, but it's still an issue, is the work Maas does with Eris's character here. She keeps teasing that there might be something more to the Eris's history, especially with the Morrigan incident. And there's the sense that Eris might be on the path to becoming more than just a wartime ally, but a really powerful friend. But none of this really goes anywhere. By the end of the book, by 750 pages later, we're left with the same questions and feelings about Eris as we were at the beginning, and that's a bit disappointing. And I was hopeful that while Nesta's storyline was all about her training and her emotional journey to recover, Cassian's kind of starts out all about having to play the diplomat, a job he didn't think himself well suited for, and was really excited early on that we might get interesting interactions between Cassian and their allies where we'd learn more about characters like Lucian and Vassa and Jurian, but especially Eris. Now, we got a handful of interactions, tense meetings and things between these characters, but we really didn't learn anything interesting about those side characters. We only kept hearing over and over again about how Cassian hates that everyone only thinks of him as an uncivilized brute, and that still hasn't really changed or gone anywhere. Yeah, that half the story really just fell flat and didn't go anywhere. Now, let's talk about the ending. I felt like everything with Briellen was wrapped up a bit too quickly for my liking. I mean, clearly this Koshai guy is the big bad behind everything and behind everything Briellen was up to. But her dynamic with Nesta was giving me a bit of a cool Snow White kind of vibe. And there's even a fun huntsman taking the princess out in the woods reference in that mountain trekking scene I mentioned earlier. So I was getting excited to explore more of the kind of who's the fairest of them all dynamic between Nesta and Briellen. But no, we don't really get that. Briellen just tries to use Cassian to kill Nesta. Briellen kind of flubs her lines at the end and isn't specific enough, giving Nesta the chance to unleash her death god powers and kill Briellen. The end of her, I guess. I never really felt scared that Cassian or Nesta were in any real danger, and I can't put my finger on why that is. I just didn't. I just felt like they'd be fine, and they were. But then also, before we can even take a breath and a moment to finalize that blood right climax, that all of that excitement, more central to Nesta's storyline, it kind of feels like the ending of the Cassian and Nesta story is stolen away and given back to Feyre and Rhys, with Feyre's pregnancy, her near death, Nesta's bargain with the mother to save everyone and make them all live happily ever after. That kind of gets to be the ending, or at least shares the ending page time with Nesta, Gwyn, and Emery, reflecting on their monumental physical achievements and progress. I did like the book, though. I don't want to give the impression that I had a horrible time with it or anything. There's a ton of fun in here still, trust me. But I do think some of those issues need to be pointed out. A couple of other things I liked, though, to end on a positive note. I like that Nesta can make swords with Cauldron Blessed powers. I liked all the implications of the harp item in particular, and I really enjoyed Nesta kind of bringing the house to life and communicating with it in her special way. I also like the whole idea, her connection with death. I think that's very intriguing. All of that was really fascinating, really good stuff. And at the end of the day, I just really like Nesta. In fact, I think she makes for a more unique and unusual lead character than Feyre. Feyre, especially by the end of Wings and Ruin, she's kind of been molded into your typical hero archetype, and it's really refreshing to have a lead like Nesta, who stands out so much from other protagonists of not only the series, but the genre as a whole. So there you have it. That's my ranking and then review of Court of Silver Flames. I'm not sure when, but I do intend to read at least the first few books of Throne of Glass, probably between now and this time next year. I'm curious to see what themes and character types Maas explores in her other series, and depending on how far I get into her other books, I'll be excited to see how these series start to cross over and influence one another. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye.